Get your greasy ass hands off of me.
Black, son, he ain't mean nothing by it.
I'm not gonna tell.
I don't like people moving behind me, sitting behind me. You gonna sit back there, you gotta sit still. I don't like.
You'll never look at Terrence Howard the same way again. For years, he was celebrated as one of the most talented and magnetic actors of his generation. But behind the fame, the red carpets, and the smooth-talking characters he played was a reality far darker than anyone imagined. From violent domestic abuse charges.
So I understand you want to set the record straight about some things in the news about your ex-wife talking about you and accusations of beating and stuff, and there's two sides to every story.
Yeah, well, it's heartbreaking.
To restraining orders and courtroom confessions. To one of the most bizarre pseudoscientific belief systems Hollywood has ever seen.
How is 1 × 1 = 1 part of the multiplication table? Now, I understand that if you're seeing it one time,
Right.
but we call that once. But the moment that you had that add the times in there, that multiplicative indicator, that means there's more than one. So now each equation is supposed to be balanced. You know, that equal sign is supposed to show that there's a balance between these two numbers over here and a balance on this one over here.
This is the disturbing truth about Terrence Howard's life off camera. Before the world knew Terrence Howard as the star of Empire or Hustle and Flow, his private life was already spiraling into dangerous territory. The year was 2001. Terrence was still climbing the ranks in Hollywood when an argument with his estranged wife, Lori McCommas, turned violent and terrifying. According to police reports, after a phone call escalated into a screaming match, Howard drove to her house, broke in, and physically assaulted her. Howard pleaded guilty to disturbing the peace, but the damage wasn't just legal, it was deeply personal. He had physically struck the mother of his children, and by his own admission, in front of them. Years later, in that same Rolling Stone interview, Howard tried to explain away his behavior by pointing to the way he was raised. "She was talking to me real strong and I lost my mind and slapped her in front of the kids," he said. But what happened next proved this wasn't an isolated moment. Lori McCommas would later describe a pattern, not a one-time mistake. Friends close to her said the abuse wasn't new and that she had often been afraid of him. Though many of these statements never made it into formal court records, they circled through the industry for years, creating a toxic cloud around his name. And if you thought it ended there, it didn't. The public image of Terrence Howard as the poetic, intense artist didn't line up with the man who kicked in a door and punched his wife in the face. This was the same year he was appearing on TV dramas and being lauded for his raw emotional depth. But behind closed doors, it was pure chaos. And instead of disappearing from headlines, his violence would escalate in more terrifying ways. If the 2001 assault was supposed to be Terrence Howard's wake-up call, it didn't work. In fact, it was only the beginning. By the early 2000s and 10s, Terrence Howard wasn't just an Oscar-nominated actor, he was a leading man in Hollywood. He had starred in Crash, Iron Man, and Hustle and Flow, and was being positioned as one of the industry's most magnetic talents. But while the public saw charm and brilliance, what was happening in his personal life painted a much more disturbing picture. On December 5, 2011, Howard's then-wife, Michelle Gent, walked into a courtroom and requested a restraining order. What she described was not just a bad marriage or a bitter breakup. It was a nightmare. Gent told the court that Howard had physically assaulted her multiple times during their relationship. She described an escalating pattern. He had broken her computer in half during a fight, stalked her online and by phone, and threatened her so severely that she feared for her life. She claimed that the abuse was consistent, intense, and unpredictable, and that she needed the court to protect her. And the judge listened. A restraining order was granted, legally barring Howard from contacting or approaching Michelle. But it didn't stop there. 2 years later, in August 2013, Michelle was back in court. This time, she had a black eye. She told the judge that while on vacation in Costa Rica, a trip that was supposed to mark a reconciliation, Terrence had physically attacked her once again. According to her statement, the assault was brutal. She said he punched her, grabbed her by the neck, and threatened her life. She provided photos of her injuries, medical records, witness accounts, and once again, the court granted a second restraining order. And what did Howard say? He denied it. In his version of events, he was the real victim. He told reporters that Michelle had come at him in a fit of rage, that she had threatened to throw hot coffee on him, and that he was just defending himself.
You know, there's a story about someone that picked up a viper that was frozen and they put it close to their chest so it can warm up. And the moment that it became warm, it bit them.
But the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't the first time Terrence had been accused of beating a woman. It wasn't the second. By this point, it was clear. Terrence Howard had a history of intimate partner violence, backed by court orders, police reports, and his own words. And yet, despite these repeated accusations, Terrence's career barely took a hit. While Michelle was in hiding, afraid for her safety, Terrence was attending premieres, signing new roles, and being praised for his performance on Empire. To some, it was baffling. To others, it was a familiar Hollywood script. Powerful man abuses women, faces no real consequences. And still, we're just scratching the surface. Because years before these restraining orders were ever filed, Terrence's rage had already made national headlines. 30,000 feet in the air. It wasn't backstage. It wasn't in private. It wasn't hidden behind courtroom walls. This time, it happened in front of dozens of strangers, in a space where there was no door to slam, no room to storm out of, and no one to protect him from himself. August 2000. Terrence Howard boarded a Continental Airlines flight, just another passenger among many. But by the time the plane touched down, he was in handcuffs. The flight attendant claimed that Howard grabbed her wrist and barked at her to get out of his way when she warned him to remain in his seat while the fasten seatbelt sign was on. Cleveland Police Lieutenant Sharon McKay said. Howard was reportedly taking his then 3-year-old daughter Heavenly to the bathroom, McKay said. Another passenger assisted the flight attendant, who was not seriously hurt, she said. When the flight landed, police were waiting. Terrence Howard was arrested and charged with misdemeanor assault. Let that sink in. He assaulted a flight attendant for asking him to follow basic safety rules. Not a fight in a club. Not a chaotic argument behind closed doors, but an unprovoked, aggressive confrontation with a woman doing her job in public. And once again, what happened afterward tells its own story. The charges were ultimately dropped due to lack of jurisdiction. Since the incident happened mid-flight, there were complex legal limitations to where and how the case could be prosecuted. But legally, walking away from the charge didn't mean the issue disappeared. If anything, it added to a growing pattern of behavior. A public record of violent outbursts against women and authority figures alike. This wasn't a man with anger issues. This was someone who exploded under pressure, lashed out when told no, and attacked people, often women, when he didn't get his way. And for Terrence Howard, this behavior wasn't something he outgrew. It was something he seemed to justify, even embrace. Over the years, Howard has talked about his upbringing, claiming that violence was normalized in his household. In interviews, he's implied that being raised by a physically abusive father distorted his sense of how to handle conflict. In 1971, when Terrence Howard was 2 years old and his mother was pregnant, his family went to a department store to see Santa. While the Howards were waiting in line, another man who was there with his family accused them of cutting. While this should have been a minor argument, things quickly turned violent when his father, Tyrone Howard, and the man began trading blows. From there, things only got more out of hand when Tyrone got a hold of a nail file and began wielding it like a knife. But as many critics have pointed out, trauma doesn't excuse abuse. And in Terrence's case, it doesn't explain why so many of his violent incidents seem to follow the same pattern. An argument escalates, a woman is harmed, and then he claims to be the victim. Even his ex-wife, Michelle Gent, the one who obtained 2 restraining orders, noted this pattern. She told the court that Howard was a master at twisting reality, that he could turn any accusation around, gaslight his victims, and make himself out to be the one under attack. And the public? For a long time, they bought it. Terrence Howard's performances were powerful, emotional, raw, but what most people didn't realize was that he wasn't always acting. The rage, the intensity, the volatility, it wasn't just for the camera. It was who he was. By the time of the 2000 airline incident, Terrence had already built a reputation among insiders as difficult, unpredictable, and dangerous. But it was only the beginning, because years later, in interviews, he wouldn't shy away from these stories. He'd lean into them. He'd talk about slapping women, losing control, defending himself, and being misunderstood. He'd try to reframe his image not as a monster, but as a man too emotional for this world, a misunderstood genius trapped by a society that couldn't handle his brilliance. But behind those poetic words was a man who had put his hands on women again and again. And once he found fame, that rage didn't go away. It just got bigger. At first, people thought he was joking. When Terrence Howard told Rolling Stone in 2015 that he had discovered a new form of logic that disproved basic math, like 1 × 1 = 1, most readers raised their eyebrows. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't trolling. He was dead serious, and that was the terrifying part. Howard claimed that traditional math was a lie. According to him, if 1 × 1 = 1, then 2 is of no value because 1 times itself has no effect. In his logic, what he called Terryology, 1 × 1 actually equals 2.
How is 1 × 1 = 1 part of the multiplication table? Now, I understand that if you're seeing it one time,
Right.
but we call that once. But the moment that you had that add the times in there, that multiplicative indicator, that means there is more than 1. So now each equation is supposed to be balanced. That equal sign is supposed to show that there's a balance between these 2 numbers over here and a balance on this one over here.
It wasn't just a passing comment. He had charts, diagrams, notebooks filled with scribbles and shapes and equations no credible scientist could understand. He reportedly spent years developing this theory, even taking meetings with physicists and engineers trying to get them to co-sign his logic. They didn't. But Terrence wasn't discouraged. In fact, he doubled down. He began speaking publicly about his discoveries, claiming that he was building new models of reality, ones that would make airplanes fly without gravity. That's right. He literally said he could kill gravity.
Rebuild the planet Saturn without gravity, and it has the rings with no animation. It has the rings and the hexagon that's observed at the very top of it, without dark matter, without dark energy, without gravity, showing that it's an outward force.
At a 2021 event in Uganda, Howard told the press that he had designed a new hydrogen technology that would defend the sovereignty of the country with a new type of drone. Experts, again, dismissed it all as nonsense. But to Terrence, it wasn't crazy. It was genius. He insisted that scientists had lied for centuries, and that his system of logic, Terryology, was the key to unlocking the truth. He even went so far as to say he was planning to release a book explaining it all. It was clear that this wasn't just an eccentric actor being weird for the camera. This was someone deeply invested in an alternative reality, one that he built himself and refused to question. Critics didn't just laugh, they worried. Because when you look at the full picture, a man with a long history of violence, abuse, and uncontrollable rage, and then you add in a worldview where he is the only person who truly understands how the universe works, that's not just arrogance, that's delusion. Even in that same Rolling Stone interview, the writer noted something chilling. Howard kept talking about how misunderstood he was, how brilliant he was, how people didn't appreciate his mind, while casually admitting to beating his ex-wife. He was using his own pseudoscience to paint himself as a victim of a world too stupid to understand him. And this wasn't happening in a vacuum. This was a man with millions of fans, a major role on Empire, a career that had bounced back stronger than ever. And instead of rehab or therapy, he was building fantasy drones and rewriting math textbooks in his head. Many fans didn't know how to react. Some thought it was hilarious. Others saw something darker. The signs of a man who was unraveling in real time, with no one around him willing to say, "Stop." It's not uncommon for fame to distort people. But in Terrence Howard's case, it didn't just distort him, it inflated him. It gave him the platform to reinvent reality, to tell himself and the world that 1 equals 2, and that if you didn't get it, you were the problem. And just like with his abuse allegations, he twisted the narrative so that he always came out on top. But the deeper he went into Terryology, the more obvious it became. This wasn't a misunderstood genius. This was a man who'd lost touch with reality, and no one had the courage to pull him back. By 2008, Terrence Howard was on top of the world. He had just landed the role of Colonel James "Rhodey" Rhodes in Iron Man, Marvel's first big leap into a shared cinematic universe. It was a huge paycheck, a fan-favorite character, and the kind of role that guaranteed years of sequels, merchandise deals, and career security. But Terrence didn't make it past the first movie. When Iron Man 2 rolled around, Marvel replaced him with Don Cheadle, a move that shocked fans.
I am Iron Man.
Howard had done a solid job in the first film, and there was no public scandal at the time. So why the sudden change? Terrence had his own answer. Robert Downey Jr. took the money that was supposed to go to me. We had a 3-picture deal, but when it came time for the sequel, they came to me with an offer that was like 1/8 of what I was promised. In other words, according to Howard, Downey Jr. betrayed him. He alleged that Marvel cut his salary to expand Downey's deal, and when he protested, they simply recast him. He later told Rolling Stone that he called Downey for help, asking him to step in and back him up. The response? Crickets. But others in the industry told a different story. Multiple sources claimed that Howard was difficult to work with, that he clashed with directors, came late to set, demanded script changes, and had explosive mood swings. According to some insiders, he was the highest-paid actor on Iron Man, even more than Downey Jr., who at the time was still rebuilding his career, and Marvel simply didn't think he was worth the headache. And this wasn't a one-time problem. Terrence Howard developed a reputation across Hollywood as a hothead, someone who could turn a small disagreement into a shouting match. On one film set, he allegedly stormed off when he found out his scenes were being trimmed. On another, crew members claimed they were walking on eggshells around him, never knowing what might set him off. Even during the height of Empire's success, reports circulated about friction behind the scenes. Some crew members described him as charming 1 minute, hostile the next. Others said he demanded rewrites, criticized other actors' performances, and created a tense atmosphere on set. The pattern was clear. Wherever Terrence Howard went, conflict seemed to follow. And when you look at the full picture, a man with a documented history of violence, a fragile ego, and a tendency to rewrite reality, it becomes harder and harder to ignore the red flags. Even his Empire co-star Taraji P. Henson, who often defended him publicly, admitted in interviews that she had to manage his emotions while working together. She once described him as intense, complicated, and a lot. Hollywood is used to eccentric actors, but with Howard, the industry started to whisper a more serious question. Was he unstable? And even more alarming, was he dangerous? Because while the Robert Downey Jr. feud made headlines, It wasn't about money. It wasn't about contracts. It was a symptom of a deeper issue. Terrence Howard believed that the world was against him, that people conspired to steal what was his, that when things fell apart, it wasn't his fault. It was betrayal, jealousy, cowardice, always someone else. And that mindset, combined with a history of violence, pseudoscience, and paranoia, made him not just difficult to work with, but unpredictable. He wasn't just losing roles, he was losing touch. Terrence Howard's personal demons didn't just show up in courtrooms or on set. They were etched into his everyday life. In multiple interviews, Howard admitted to years of heavy alcohol and cocaine use, particularly during the height of his early fame. He described drinking to numb himself, spiraling into toxic relationships, and self-destructing when things didn't go his way. "I used to drink every night. Coke, too. I was trying to quiet the noise." That noise, his paranoia, anger, and instability, never fully went away. Friends described him as brilliant, but deeply troubled. Hollywood insiders said the industry looked the other way, enabling his behavior for the sake of ratings and revenue. Even as he spiraled publicly, Howard was still landing roles, still getting applause, still being painted as a tortured genius, not a dangerous man. He blamed ex-wives, producers, studios, journalists, but never himself. In the end, that's Terrence Howard's most terrifying trait. Not the violence, not the rage, but the delusion, the belief that he's above accountability, that physics, morality, and reality don't apply to him, and for too long, the world let him believe it. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.